spring of 1942. While the whole world is watching the Battle of Moscow, one of the most terrible tragedies of the Great Patriotic War is unfolding in the marshes near Leningrad. 130,000 Soviet soldiers are slowly dying in the encirclement, falling into the quagmire, fighting for every meter of impassable swamps. A unique German newsreel shot by Wehrmacht officers reveals the terrible truth about the Lyuban Operation, an operation that was supposed to break the siege of Leningrad, but turned into a disaster. Friends, subscribe to the channel, and we will begin. The Lyuban Operation, the hope of breaking the blockade. At the beginning of 1942, the situation around Leningrad remained critical. The city, trapped in the blockade since September 1941, was slowly dying of hunger. Every day claimed thousands of lives of Leningraders. The only link connecting the city with the mainland, the Road of Life through Lake Ladoga, could not provide a full-fledged supply to the 3 million megacity. The Soviet command understood that a decisive blow was needed to break the blockade ring and connect Leningrad with the rest of the country. Thus was born the plan of the Luban offensive operation. The plan looked ambitious, using the forces of several armies of the Volkhov and Leningrad fronts to launch converging strikes, surround and destroy the units of the German 18th Army that were holding the blockade. The main role in this grandiose plan was assigned to the 2nd Shock Army under the command of Lieutenant General Nikolai Kirillovich Klikov. Breaking through impassable swamps, the operation began on January 7, 1942. The 2nd Shock Army, newly formed and equipped according to wartime standards, was supposed to break through the German front in the most unexpected place, where the enemy considered an offensive impossible. It was an area north of Novgorod, the Myasnoy area, continuous swamps, small streams, impenetrable forests. The Germans kept a small force here, believing that nature itself would protect their flank better than any fortifications. But the Soviet command relied on surprise. And at first, the plan worked. After heavy artillery training, units of the 2nd Shock Army broke through the German defenses, going 60 to 70 kilometers into the enemy's rear. A section of the Novgorod-Chudovo Railway, the most important communication line of Army Group North, was cut. Soviet troops entered the Luban area, creating a real threat of encirclement of the entire German group that was blockading Leningrad. Restrained optimism prevailed at the headquarters of the Supreme High Command. It seemed that in a few more days the blockade would be broken. The 54th Army of the Leningrad front was advancing towards the 2nd Shock Army from the west. They were only 15 to 20 kilometers apart. Success was closer than ever. The death trap is closing. But the German command quickly assessed the danger. General Georg von Kuchler, commander of Army Group North, deployed fresh divisions to the breakout site. Using a well-developed network of railways and highways, the Wehrmacht quickly gathered reserves and launched counterattacks on the flanks of the Soviet breakthrough. The corridor connecting the 2nd Shock Army with the main forces of the Volkhov front began to narrow rapidly. What was several kilometers wide yesterday has turned into a narrow neck, shot through by German artillery. Every attempt to deliver ammunition, food, or evacuate the wounded turned into a deadly mission. By the end of March, the width of the corridor had been reduced to 3 to 4 kilometers. German troops were methodically crushing the Soviet units holding this vital artery. Every day brought new losses, but the order to continue the offensive remained in force. The command of the Volkhov front, led by Army General Kirill Meretskov, continued to plan a new offensive on Luban, unwilling to admit that the operation had failed. But another enemy turned out to be scarier than the German machine guns and artillery, the Russian Spring. On March 29, rapid snowmelt began. The frosts that had trapped the marshes receded, and the area turned into a continuous mess of mud and water. The roads where the vehicles had difficulty passing were gone. The impassable marshes cut off the 2nd Shock Army from supplies more reliably than any blockade. A German newsreel shot by Wehrmacht officers in the spring of 1942 captured this nightmarish picture. Endless swamps flooded with meltwater, narrow gates made of logs and brushwood, through which Soviet soldiers with sacks on their shoulders made their way alone, risking their lives. Flooded positions where soldiers stood knee-deep in icy water. Abandoned machinery, stuck in a quagmire. It was not a war in the usual sense, it was a struggle for survival in an environment where nature itself had become the enemy. The supply of the 2nd Shock Army actually stopped. If earlier convoys of trucks had passed through the corridor, even with fighting, now even horse-drawn carts could not move. Special teams of soldiers and mobilized local residents carried ammunition and meager food rations for 30 to 40 kilometers through impassable swamps. Many died on the way, falling into a quagmire or coming under German fire. At the end of March, intelligence reported disturbing information. The Germans were preparing a major operation to completely encircle and destroy the Second Shock Army. The Wehrmacht was pulling in additional forces, pulling up artillery, and concentrating aviation. The plan was simple and effective: to cut the narrow corridor and lock the Soviet troops in a swamp bag without supplies and escape routes. Logic dictated the only correct solution was to immediately withdraw troops while the corridor was still holding. But the Soviet command continued to believe in the possibility of a successful offensive. The headquarters of the Volkhov Front planned a third attempt to take Luban, ignoring the real state of affairs. On April 3rd, a new offensive by the Second Shock Army began. The result was predictable: exhausted, hungry troops, who did not have enough ammunition, could not break through the strengthened German defenses. The attacks collapsed in the first few hours. The losses were growing, but there was no result. On April 13th, General Klikov, who was seriously ill, was evacuated from the combat area. The Chief of Staff temporarily assumed command of the Second Shock Army. The troops found themselves virtually without leadership at a critical moment. People were starving, sick, and losing their fighting ability every day. On April 20th, the commander of the Volkhov Front, General Meretskov, approved the candidacy of a new commander, Lieutenant General Andrei Andreevich Vlasiv, who had previously successfully commanded the 20th Army near Moscow and enjoyed a reputation as a talented military commander. But Vlasiv arrived too late. What he saw shocked even the seasoned military commander. The condition of the troops was catastrophic. The soldiers were exhausted, and many were barely able to stand from hunger. The uniforms were a disaster, especially the shoes. The fighters walked in bandages or even barefoot in the cold spring mud. The sanitary conditions were appalling. Dysentery, typhus and other diseases mowed down people no worse than enemy bullets. There was virtually no medical care. There was nowhere to evacuate the wounded. The corridor was shot through. The hospitals inside the boiler are overcrowded. There is no medicine, and operations were performed without anesthesia. Many of the wounded did not die from wounds, but from gangrene and infections. There was enough ammunition for several days of fighting. There is even less food. The daily ration was reduced to a few breadcrumbs and a spoonful of porridge. The horses were eaten long ago. Cases of cannibalism began, which were not accepted to talk about either then or after the war. The German noose is tightening. The German command was methodically preparing the final blow. A powerful group was concentrated in the narrow sector of the front where the corridor was held. The Wehrmacht brought up fresh divisions, including elite SS units. Artillery has shot down all roads and trails. Aviation patrolled the sky, preventing Soviet planes from dropping cargo to the encircled. The German newsreel captured the confidence of the German soldiers. They knew it was only a matter of time. The Soviet troops are trapped in a trap from which there is no way out. Wehrmacht officers posed for cameras against the backdrop of captured positions, abandoned Soviet equipment, endless swamps that became graves for thousands of Red Army soldiers. In the spring of 1942, one of the most terrible tragedies of the war unfolded in the area of Myasnoy. 130,000 Soviet soldiers were surrounded, with no hope of escape. Ahead of them were months of agonizing struggle for survival, attempts at a breakthrough that would cost tens of thousands of lives. The Lyuban Operation, conceived as a rescue of besieged Leningrad, turned into a disaster. Neither the task of defeating the grouping of German troops on the Volkhov, nor the breakthrough of the siege of Leningrad, nor the global task of defeating Army Group North and withdrawing the front line to Luga were completed. The irretrievable losses of the Volkhov Front and the 54th Army of the Leningrad Front during the operation amounted to 95,064 people, 213,303 wounded, and 308,367 in total.